Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog. Good evening. I'm Yvonne Stapp, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Tonight we hear about speech impairments ranging from stuttering to total paralysis, as in Lockedin Syndrome. Our guest is Professor Frank Guenther of Boston University. Dr. Guenther is a professor in BU's Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences, as well as in the Department of Biomedical Engineering. He's also the director of the Boston University Speech Lab and director of the BU Neural Prosthesis Lab. Dr. Guenther is a leader in three areas: research on brain mechanisms underlying speech impairments, development of computational models of speech mechanisms, and development of a brain-computer interface device for completely paralyzed patients. Dr. Guenther has published widely and given numerous keynote and distinguished lectures worldwide. His research combines theoretical modeling and behavioral and neuroimaging experiments to characterize the neural computations underlying speech. He's the originator of the leading model of the neural processes involved in speech production, which he'll discuss tonight. Dr. Guenther is especially well known for his work on brain-computer interfaces to enable communication for individuals suffering from Lockedin Syndrome. And that work has received a great deal of media coverage. Tonight, he'll tell us all about this exciting work. We are very honored to welcome Dr. Frank Guenther. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me.
And if you would begin, please, by telling us something about the complexity of speech.
Okay, well, language is probably the most complicated cognitive skill that everyone develops. So if you're a human and you grow up with other humans, you'll learn to speak and you'll learn to produce sentences, which it's a very advanced skill that we have. And so we believe that language developed with the first Homo sapiens about 200,000 years ago. And it was a very major advance in abilities that really gave a competitive advantage to humans that allowed us to live beyond our competitors. And so it's a skill that's crucial to our survival, and it's something that is really unique to humans. Now, language is a very complex task, and it involves several different parts of the brain, many parts of the brain. In fact, hundreds of thousands, millions of neurons are involved in even the simplest speech task that we do. And our focus in our lab is actually on what we would call speech, which is a subset of language capabilities, where we're not concerned so much with the meaning of words or grammar of sentences. We're concerned with the motor act of speaking, so the act of moving your tongue and your lips and your larynx and your other what we would call speech articulators in order to generate sounds that convey words to your listener. Now, speech is an amazing motor task. In fact, it's probably the most complex task performed by humans and maybe by any animal. And to give an example of that, consider the word dilapidated, which this is a word that we can all say very easily in 1 second. There are 11 different speech sounds or phonemes within this word, and that means that each one of those sounds is produced in less than 1/10 of a second. And yet we all can do this. All neurologically normal humans are capable of doing this. That's a rate of movement that's roughly equivalent to the fastest typist in the world. It's an amazing motor act, and yet we all effortlessly develop that capability. So our focus is on how humans develop speech capabilities and how the system works, how the different parts of the brain work together to generate speech output.
I see. Now, when you say the word dilapidated, sometimes we do trip over these words, right? We get the syllables mixed up and so on. But Do you look at language development like in children as they are developing, where that's really tricky to put 4-syllable words together and so on? But can you give us any background on this?
So to develop speech skills requires a large number of things to happen in your brain. And some of the earliest things happen shortly after birth. So even before you can move your tongue well or do any of the things that we would consider speaking, you're listening to language and you're hearing sounds from people, from adults around you, from people who know the language. And even in the first few months of life, infants are developing the ability to detect sounds in their language, and they're actually losing the ability to hear sound differences from other languages. So a common example of that is Japanese infants. By the time they're 1 year old, they lose the ability to hear the acoustic features that differentiate R's from L's. They had that at birth, but they lose it over the first year.
So soon.
Right, and they lose it because their brain is learning to hear their own language, which doesn't make that distinction. So their brain auditory system becomes specialized for hearing their own language, and that's a very important part of the development process. So that occurs before you even start speaking. Another very important milestone in the development of speech occurs when an infant starts to babble. Early on, around 6 months of age, infants make sounds, and they're learning things about their vocal mechanism. So they're learning, for example, how to change their pitch or the volume of their speech well before they produce anything that sounds like a word. So the development of the motor system also begins very early, 6 or 8 months of age. Around 8 to 10 months of age, infants go through a babbling stage where they start to produce speech-like sounds, and this occurs largely because they just move their jaws up and down at the right frequency. That opens and closes the vocal tract, and that produces consonant-like sounds and vowel-like sounds that start to sound a lot like speech utterances. And a typical infant will often produce utterances such as mama, papa, da-da during this stage. And this may be one of the reasons that we choose these words for mother and father. They're some of the first speech-like utterances that occur. Around 10 months of age, 12 months of age, they start varying their movements while they move the jaw up and down. So they start varying their tongue movements, and this starts producing more complicated syllables and eventually the first words. During this period is when the first words develop. Now, what they're doing when they're babbling is, amongst other things, they're learning how their movements create sounds. And so they're learning what we would call a mapping between articulatory movements and sound output. And that becomes crucial later when they want to imitate sounds in their language. The things that they learn while they're babbling tell them, well, if I want to make a sound that sounds like this, I know now because when I was babbling, I heard myself produce this sound. I know what kind of movements to make. So these learning processes are developing connections within the brain, within what we would call the speech network, which is the network of brain regions that are involved in producing speech. And this sort of learning involves learning mappings between auditory information and motor information, and between somatosensory information, so information about what it feels like, what the tactile pattern feels like when I produce speech sounds, and the relationship between that sort of information and auditory information as well as motor information. So these three types of information are being used to train up the brain network during babbling. And then later they develop yet another type of information, which is phonological information. These would be speech sounds as discrete units that they can perceive and produce. And so this development occurs around 10, 12 months of age. And that's when they start producing the first words. So they're in this process in the first year of life. A tremendous number of things are happening to develop this speech motor system.
It's pretty awesome, isn't it?
It's pretty amazing. Yep.
Now, they can't produce all sounds,
right,
correct? And also, you see with youngsters having difficulties with sort of, what would I say, switching the syllables and things in words. I'm trying to think of a word where that happens. I think I gave you an example, runny babbit instead of bunny rabbit, but there are many of those. But like R, I think is very late. Why is that?
Well, R is actually a particularly difficult sound to move in some ways. As an adult, we are very, very efficient, and we use different shapes of our tongue to produce R depending on when it comes in the utterance. So if it is after a G, we use one tongue shape to produce the R. If it's after a B, we use a very different shape of the tongue. Most other sounds, the tongue shape relates pretty closely to the sound being produced. So for most vowels, for example, there's roughly one tongue shape that's used to produce the vowel in different contexts. R is a sound where it takes us a long time to learn it because it's a more complicated movement act, but once we've learned it, we're able to produce it very, very easily as adults. So children have difficulty, especially around 3 years of age, around this time when they're learning all the different sounds of the language, mainly because it's a more complicated thing to articulate in terms of how variable the movements are to produce it.
Right. That at what point is the motor cortex or the language part sort of mature enough that children are then able to articulate pretty clearly?
Right. So around 3 years of age to about 5 years of age are when that's the time period when children really develop a full vocabulary, and it's during this period that you might start to see a developmental disorder like stuttering. So stuttering usually starts around that age, and about 5% of kids stutter at one point in time, but most of them develop out of that. So their motor systems improve, and the stuttering goes away, usually within 1 or 2 years. On the other hand, about 1% of people, and especially in boys more than girls, we see that the stuttering doesn't go away. So they're able to produce speech most of the time, but occasionally they have trouble, especially at the onsets of words, getting the word to come out. And you can tell to some degree whether it's likely that a stutter will stay, depending on the severity and the way that the child stutters initially. So just a block stutter is one where the word you're ready, your articulator's in the right position to produce the word, you just can't continue on. If a child has severe blocks, that's more likely to not resolve fully with development. What this tells us is that as we develop these skills to produce all the different sounds in our language, the problem is becoming more and more difficult. It's involving more and more complex interactions with larger portions, different portions of the brain, and it's only when we get to this pretty complicated level of speech that we see things like stuttering occurring. They don't occur when we're babbling generally. It's when the problem of speech becomes a more difficult problem, and when it becomes linked to language, where by language I mean developing sentences and things like that. That's when these disorders, stuttering in particular, starts.
This is mechanical then, but it's the mechanics of the speaking. They know what they want to say inside. That's not a problem. But then, but so it is production.
It's the brain mechanisms that control the movements that have the problem in stuttering. So in particular, there's a portion of the brain that's called the basal ganglia, which is very important for initiating movements at the right time. And if I want to produce a word like dilapidated, I have to be very accurate in my timing of the different movements. It's fast and requires very accurate movements. And so with the stuttering, the basal ganglia may be involved, and it's not entirely clear, but it appears that that circuit is not quite normal, and so occasionally it has problems initiating the next speech sound in the utterance. So that brain region is particularly important for stuttering, we think.
In this case, sometimes stuttering seems to run in families. Is
Yes.
that true? So do you think there is a genetic component?
There definitely is a genetic component to stuttering. If you have many relatives who stutter, you're more likely to stutter. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily the case that you'll stutter. And therapies can help you resolve the stuttering over time, but there's certainly a component of that that's genetic, and that's probably related to the genetics, the genes that develop the speech network. So genes that develop connections between different parts of the brain may be slightly impaired, and so the connectivity in the network may not be quite right. And when the network is taxed with a difficult speech task, this can lead to instability in the network that's controlling the movements, and that instability manifests as stuttering.
Okay, so then that's strictly a physical problem then
Right.
that can be inherited. And in terms of overcoming this, has there been progress in helping people to overcome?
Certainly some progress. So a lot of the therapy is aimed at avoiding getting stressed during a stutter. So,
oh, good luck, right.
Right. So the more stressed you are, the more likely you are to stutter, and there can be a feedback loop where you're having difficulty speaking, and initially kids aren't self-aware of their stutters, and so initially they don't show a lot of the same behaviors that you'll see later in stuttering that develop as a kind of compensatory mechanism.
I see.
So often a child who stutters may not notice. They occasionally stutter, but they move through that pretty quickly. But as they become more self-aware of their speech, then they may notice that they're making mistakes, and this makes them more nervous and generally more stressed, and this can worsen the problem. Now, under those circumstances, occasionally they may make a movement, so an arm movement, for example, that coincides with the release of the stutter, and over time they can actually kind of develop those movements as part of their speech. So we call those secondary behaviors that can occur. So often a person who stutters might blink, for example, because their brain has learned that when they blink, it's more likely that they'll get through the stutter.
They facilitates the motion. Is that the
right?
Very interesting.
Yeah. So they basically they have this associative learning occurring when they're speaking that builds in these other behaviors, and these behaviors are very wildly different between different people who stutter. And so if you look at adults who stutter, you see a much wider range of behaviors than you would see in children who stutter, simply because they've developed so many of these secondary effects. So this makes stuttering a difficult thing to study because, especially in adults, where most of the people we look at are adults in research. Certainly there are a number of people looking at children who stutter, but as the further along the child gets and into adulthood, they have developed many secondary aspects, secondary behaviors that become difficult to dissociate from the original issue of what stopped them from producing the speech. And so that's part of why stuttering has been misunderstood for hundreds of years, simply because people think of it, and for many years they thought of it as more of a kind of psychological problem rather than a neural problem. Partly because there's such a wildly varying different set of behaviors that occur in different people who stutter. So in recent decades, people have come around to understand that in fact it's of a neurological origin, that there is an impairment in the speech network somewhere that leads to this stuttering behavior, and really our goal is to understand that the core behavior of stuttering and the core problems that lead to stuttering. Even those are very difficult to determine because there's no single brain region that is impaired in somebody who stutters. It's not as simple.
That's the interesting thing. So you
Right.
can't just go into the basal ganglia and
Right.
move things around a wee bit or anything.
Yeah, and you can't look at a brain scan and see that, oh, this person stutters because they have a problem in this part of the brain.
Right.
Their brains look normal structurally. Only if you look at a large number of people do you start to see some patterns of differences in the brains of people who stutter compared to the brains of people who don't stutter. And that those insights have only come in recent decades since the advent of neuroimaging in particular. So speech is something that doesn't occur in animals, so we don't have access to a lot of the sorts of data that we could collect in animal studies. We can't go in with electrodes and measure, except in very rare cases, what's going on in the speech parts of the brain. With neuroimaging, so functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, and positron emission tomography, or PET, these are techniques that allow us to measure brain activity by measuring blood flow in the brain, basically. When a part of the brain is active, that part of the brain needs more oxygen to generate electrical signals, and that oxygen gets there by increasing the blood flow to that part of the brain. These technologies can measure those blood flow changes, and that gives us a picture of the brain activity that's occurring during speech. Magnetic resonance imaging also allows us to get very detailed pictures of the circuit, the axons that connect different parts of the brain together, the sizes of the different bumps or gyri in the brain. And over time, by comparing brains of people who stutter to brains of people who don't stutter, what we've discovered are a number of different sort of anomalies that you see. Anomalies in connectivity, especially in the cortex, in the left hemisphere, which is very important for speech and language, and also some anomalies in the brain activity during speech. But these anomalies are not terribly consistent from individual to individual, and these things highlight that stuttering is really what we would call a system-level problem rather than a problem that is located in one single part of the brain.
Right, so the opposite of localized, is that the idea? So
Exactly.
it's a much larger thing, and it's surprised.
And this makes it harder to understand because we can't just go in and say, oh, this part of the brain must be impaired because they stutter. Let's really study that part of the brain.
Right.
In fact, we see large portions of the speech network showing anomalies in the brain. They're not major differences between individuals who stutter and individuals who don't, but they do show up, and there's some consistency in them. So, for example, in the left hemisphere, connections between the cortical regions that control speech, what we see is that those connections are weaker in people who stutter, but on the right hemisphere, the connections tend to be stronger in people who stutter. And so this is a topic of much debate right now in the literature. What we think this is indicative of is that the left hemisphere system is what's really involved in generating speech normally. That's the part of the brain that generates language, and the language system connects to the speech motor system, mainly using left hemisphere mechanisms. And the right hemisphere, we think, is more involved in kind of correcting errors when you hear yourself producing something improperly. And so what may be happening in stuttering is that the left hemisphere isn't working quite right. That's why we see these connections that aren't as strong in people who stutter, and that forces the right hemisphere to do more of the job.
Try to compensate.
Exactly, and so it's not completely successful in compensating because the left hemisphere is specialized for speech.
Right.
And so if you look at brain activity in people who stutter, you see that their right hemisphere is more active than normal, and their left hemisphere is, if anything, a little bit less active than normal. And then this is one of the things that we're trying to fully understand. What does that mean? And so even though you see connectivity anomalies in the right hemisphere, that doesn't mean that the right hemisphere is impaired. In this case, it may simply mean that the right hemisphere is forced to do more of the job during speech, and that's what causes these connections to become stronger.
I see. Is this very different from what you see with brain damage? So in Brocas Aphasia and in apraxia and so on. Can you tell us about that a little bit? Since you mentioned the, the left hemisphere, the importance of the left hemisphere and so on.
So really the first major inroad into understanding how the brain controls language came in the 19th century with work by Pierre Brocas, who's a French physician, and he had looked at the brains post-mortem of people who had very bad speech output problems. So a famous patient of his was named Tan. In the literature, they were called Tan because that was the only word this person could produce. When you would ask them a question, they would just answer Tan. So he looked at the brain of Tan afterwards and noticed that there was damage in what we call the left inferior frontal gyrus. So it's a particular part of the cortex that's very important, and it's now referred to as Broca's area. That area is very important for language generation. Another set of studies a bit later in the 19th century determined that there's a second part of the brain in the left hemisphere that's very important for understanding language. This is called Wernicke's area, after Carl Wernicke, the discoverer of this area. And so Brocas' area is a language production area, Wernicke's area is a language reception area, and they're connected through connections. And so those are cases of disorders that occur due to massive damage to a particular part of the brain.
Okay.
Strokes generally cause this sort of damage, so aphasia, this is a word that we use to describe language difficulties that arise from strokes generally. And aphasias are kind of out of the domain of what we would study because they're at the language level rather than the speech level.
Right.
But you do see disorders of speech that occur with strokes as well. And so, for example, if you have a stroke in your what we call the premotor cortex, which is a part of the cortex that's involved in planning movements, especially in the case of speech, that can lead to what we call apraxia of speech. And this is a disorder where you know what you want to say, you can generate the sentence in your head, but you have difficulty pulling out the motor programs that are needed to command the muscles to move in the way to generate the speech sounds. There's no weakness in the muscles. People with apraxia can usually do other things with their speech articulators, their tongue. They can eat and swallow and stick their tongue out on command, but they don't have access to the complex motor programs that generate these finely timed movements for speech. So their difficulty is one of generating the movements, not of generating language. So that involves a slightly lower level of the brain than a language disorder, but again, it's a disorder that's primarily left lateralized. So damage to the left premotor cortex will cause apraxia of speech, but damage to the right premotor cortex does not.
Right.
Other sorts of brain damage can occur in subcortical structures that are very important. So I mentioned the basal ganglia. This is important for initiating speech. A disease like Parkinson's disease is caused, it basically is the result of impairments in the part of the brain that generates a chemical called dopamine, which is very important for signaling and learning, especially in the basal ganglia. And so people with Parkinson's disease become impaired in their ability to initiate movements. And so with speech movements, what you see is that their speech it's quieter than normal, their movements are truncated, they don't move as far, so their speech isn't quite as easy to understand. And so this is an impairment that's, again, localized to part of the brain, the basal ganglia, and so it has a particular effect related to the function of that brain region. Another brain region that's important, that's subcortical, is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is particularly important for generating fine-timed movements. So the movements of speech are very well coordinated and they require very accurate timing. The cerebellum is very crucial for that, and damage to the cerebellum, a stroke that involves the cerebellum or a disease that attacks the cerebellum, such as Friedreich's ataxia, those diseases lead to slurring of speech and problems articulating rapidly. So they basically make the speech clumsy. The movements are not as accurate as they need to be. And so from these sorts of disorders, we learn a lot about what the different brain structures are doing in speech. These differ from stuttering in that stuttering doesn't have such a clear-cut origin of a disorder. As I said, it's more of a system-level problem that involves the entire speech network not functioning properly. And so those sorts of disorders are more difficult to understand why they're happening and more difficult to treat them in terms of fixing the brain mechanisms that aren't working properly.
Right. Before we leave that, I just want to get clear Brocas aphasia. If you would, please, when you said originally this came about the man could only utter one word. And with Brocas, you see they can often utter more than one word. But what is going on there? Is that very localized too?
Yes, so people with Brocas aphasia can perceive speech normally. They have some difficulties with very complicated sentences, with complicated syntax. Those cases appear to use the frontal cortex where Brocas aphasia damage occurs. but generally they can perceive speech pretty well. What they can't do is generate well-structured utterances. So they have a difficulty in using grammar to construct sentences. Their sentences tend to be very short, or maybe just a word or two that they're producing. In extreme cases like tan, there was only one word that the person can produce, but in less extreme cases, they can utter words. Often they'll answer with one-word answers simply because the mechanisms needed to generate larger sentences are not working properly. So that differs, as I mentioned, from Wernicke's aphasia. In that case, people can generate sentences, but those sentences are often meaningless because the part of the brain that understands speech is the part that's impaired in that case. So they have difficulties understanding speech that if you spoke to somebody with Wernicke's aphasia, they may not understand what you're saying at all, but their speech production mechanism appears to be relatively intact. They can generate sentences. Usually they don't make a lot of mistakes in articulation. The mistakes they do are usually substituting properly produced versions of the wrong sound rather than the sorts of impairments that would occur with cerebellum damage where the sounds are simply not produced properly. They're trying to produce the right sound in that case. They just can't generate the right muscle commands.
I see. I need two things that you've worked on this, but you have these two other specialties, and that is, one is the modeling. I'd like to ask about the Diva model. I won't try the okay. You can decode that for us, and then we have about in our remaining time to talk about the brain computer interface too, if you will. So first, the Diva model. The modeling is so important.
Okay, well, so as I mentioned, neuroimaging has allowed us to look at the functioning brain, and a tremendous amount of data is built up about what brain parts are active, how they're connected, and so forth. And so imagine the brain as an electrical circuit. In fact, it is an electrical circuit. If we wanted to understand that electrical circuit, we might develop a wiring diagram. So the first thing we would want to know is what parts of the brain are involved in producing speech and how they're connected. And neuroimaging has given us a lot of that information. So we know basically which regions are involved. We know which ones are connected to each other strongly and which ones are less connected to each other. And so we have kind of a wiring diagram, but what we don't know is what kind of processing is going on in any one of those brain regions. And so if there's damage to a brain region, you might imagine if it was a big electrical circuit, think of a brain region as a chip in that circuit. Well, if there was damage to one of those chips, if we knew what that chip did, we would have a good chance of replacing it with something. So if we know what function a brain region is carrying out, we will be much better positioned to treat disorders of that brain region. So what we need is not just the chip, which chips are there and how they're connected. We need to know what each of those chips is doing. And so this is a pretty complicated circuit, and imaging doesn't really tell us directly, at least, what that part of the brain's doing. It just says that it's active during speech. So what we do to try to organize all of this information that's collected is we develop what we would call a neurocomputational model. And within this model, it's a neural network model where the components in the model correspond to roughly to neurons in the brain. We have the components associated with particular brain regions. These brain regions are connected through axonal connections, which we model, and we model the synapses at the end of those axonal connections. And when you learn to speak, what you're really doing in your brain is you're adjusting these synapses between the different brain regions, and that adjustment process allows you to transform, for example, an auditory signal into a motor command that could generate that auditory signal. And so what our model does is try to model with mathematical equations what's happening in these brain regions. What is the neural representation being used? Is this representing muscle commands, or is this representing auditory information? And how those brain regions process that information and send it to other brain regions. So what we do is in effect, we take a very educated guess as to what's going on in the different brain regions, and we model that with equations. So we have a motor cortex in our model, which has a set of equations that basically transform information the way we think that brain region is working. Now, initially, we don't know if these guesses are correct or not, and so what we do is we can do computer simulations of the model and see what happens,
Nice.
and we can compare that to what we see in experiments. And to develop the model over now 2 decades, what we've done is we've taken our initial model, we generate a prediction from that model. So we run a computer simulation and say that, well, we think this part of the brain is involved in transforming auditory error signals that when you hear yourself make a mistake into corrective motor commands. Well, if that's the case, then if we could develop an experiment where we perturb your auditory feedback, we change what you hear while you're speaking so that it sounds incorrect, that should light up the part of the brain that we say is doing this. And so we've done a number of experiments over the years in this way where we are essentially testing predictions of this model. Often the model is correct, we verify its function, and then we know more about, we're more sure about what a particular brain region is doing. But sometimes we're wrong, and sometimes we see results that aren't accounted for by the model. And this is very important because it allows us to improve the model. So over time, we would run an experiment, change the model as needed to account for the data, use this newer model to generate new predictions, test those predictions, and keep going around in this cycle of improving the model, generating new predictions from the model, and testing those predictions to determine more and more accurately what these brain regions are doing.
That's really impressive. I mean, I didn't realize it had taken 10 years. So far, it's still working.
20 years.
This is 20, and it's the leading model, I think.
So over time now, we're very confident about many of the things that the model does. And so now we have a model that tells us not just what's connected to what, but what each of the processing areas is doing. And our end goal for this work has always been to better understand what happens when the brain is damaged. There's some sort of problem in the brain. How does that lead to these disorders? And ultimately, how can we repair this? Or what kind of therapy would be best to try to overcome this sort of thing? So the model now allows us to do things like test hypotheses about stuttering. So as I mentioned, we see impaired connectivity in the left hemisphere of people who stutter. Well, we can implement that in the model. We can impair the connectivity in the left hemisphere of the model, and we can run simulations of it, and we can look at and see, is the behavior what we see in stuttering? Do the movements that the model make, do they look like the movements that someone who stutters makes when they're stuttering? And also, because it's a neural network model and each of the components is associated with a brain region, we can generate predictions about brain activity from this stuttering version of the model. So if we impair connectivity in the left hemisphere in our model, that creates errors in production, and that invokes what we call the feedback control system, which is involved in correcting those errors, and that happens to be more right lateralized in the brain. So if we impair the left hemisphere connectivity, we get more activity in the right hemisphere, as you would see in a person who stutters. So this allows us to test more complicated hypotheses about what's happening in the brain. This is particularly important for a system-level problem like stuttering, because you can't, there's no other way to really tell why the system's not working.
Fabulous. It must be very satisfying.
Yes, it is.
Another area that you have been, I think, a leader in is this development of a brain-computer interface for locked-in patients. We have like a few minutes left. Can you tell us about this? Because this is really an exciting area, and I'm not sure people know what locked-in is.
Sure. So maybe the most extreme form of speech disorder is the complete inability to speak. And with Lockedin Syndrome, this is a case where it usually occurs due to either a stroke in the motor output pathways, the very extreme output pathways that are involved in voluntary movements, or a degenerative disease such as ALS, which impairs the motor output pathways. In those cases, people can completely lose the ability to move voluntarily. So the patient is completely paralyzed, including a lack of speech. Often they do maintain some residual eye movement capabilities, but they're fully conscious. So it's only the output part of the system that's impaired. Their ability to generate language in their head is still intact, and so their language network and their speech network are largely intact.
It's only comprehension.
Right. They're able to understand speech. Their sensory capabilities are generally good. They just cannot move. And as you can imagine, this is a very debilitating thing to have for many reasons, but probably the most important thing that happens from their perspective is the inability to communicate with people, with their loved ones, with their caretakers. They're unable to even tell them their most basic needs. So it's a very, very debilitating disorder. And it's a case where most of the system is intact, but only the output part of the system is impaired. And so our goal in the neural prosthesis lab is to try to tap into the circuitry that does work and to use the information we get from that circuitry to bypass their impaired movement abilities. And so, in particular, what we've worked on is a system that involves a brain-computer interface with electrodes in the speech motor cortex. The speech motor cortex is the part of the brain that is responsible for sending commands to the muscles. And so that part of the brain is poorly understood simply because monkeys don't talk and other animals don't talk, so we have very little information about what the neurons do. But we do have a computational model where we've spent many years now developing an understanding of what processing is happening in the speech motor cortex. And so we can use that model as a guide to help us decode the information from that part of the brain. And so in a project we did in collaboration with Philip Kennedy, who's a neurologist who developed electrodes that could be implanted in the human brain and left in there permanently, we decoded these brain signals and tried to build a system that allowed the individual to try to speak. While they're trying to speak, our system looks at the brain activity in that part of the brain, decodes that into what we think the acoustic signal is that they're trying to generate, and then we send that information to a speech synthesizer, which is just software on a computer that generates an acoustic signal that we can play back to the individual. And we built a system so that this process occurs very quickly. So within 1/20th of a second, the brain activity that's occurring in your motor cortex is transformed into an acoustic signal, and that delay is actually approximately what the delay is in the normal system. So in your motor cortex, about 50 milliseconds before the sound comes out, your motor cortex is commanding the movements for that sound. And what our goal was to basically give the patient feedback of the sounds that they're trying to generate. Now, we are pulling out a tiny, tiny percentage of the information that's involved in speech. We're recording from a handful of neurons, dozens at most, whereas there are hundreds of millions of neurons that are involved in generating language. And so we're not going to be perfect at doing that. But by providing the user with feedback from our attempts to decode their speech, they can hear the sounds coming out. Because his speech network is intact largely, he's able to babble with this system, attempting to produce words, and over time he gets better and better and better at producing speech output. And so in this case we were able to build a system that allowed this person to produce vowels. They couldn't produce entire words, partly because mainly because the amount of information we were pulling out of the brain was so small. We only had 2 electrodes, so 2 wires from the brain coming out of the brain, but that was still enough information to allow this person to learn to produce vowels using this brain-computer interface, which really, in our mind, was a proof of concept that with more electrodes and more sophisticated technology, which is occurring all the time in this area, eventually we'll be able to restore speech through this sort of brain-computer interface. And it really doesn't require much hardware other than, I mean, the implanted electrodes, that's the most difficult part, and but the hardware for generating speech is just a laptop computer that has speech synthesis software on it. So it seems clear that with enough time and enough development in this area, which requires, of course, research funding and very large groups getting together with very different expertise areas, with time we will, in fact, be able to provide speech capabilities to these people with Lockedin Syndrome and this will be revolutionary for them when that's
I think it will,
capable.
because I can't imagine anything more frustrating for an individual to just be totally cut off in that way when your mind is entirely intact.
Right.
But you say this will develop. There's not a question about that. Then the prospects are there. All you need is time and funding,
money,
and time and money.
So looking at just given the proof of concept that we were able to do with 2 wires. Systems today have at least 100 electrodes, sometimes 200, and this number is always increasing. With that kind of information coming out of the speech areas, this problem just gets easier and easier in terms of the problem of decoding what they intend to say. And so, in my mind at least, it's clear that the basics of the technology are already in place. There's a tremendous amount of development that has to occur.
Right.
All of so far, everything that's been done with these sorts of brain-computer interfaces has been done in the laboratory.
Yeah.
They require a lot of specialized equipment, and they've required research teams that had very many areas of expertise. So there are only a couple of places in the United States and in the world, for that matter, that do this sort of thing, largely because of the amount of resources required to do this sort of research. So one big hurdle is FDA approval for implantable electrodes, for example. To get FDA approval to do this, there are many, many years of studies being done, first in mice, then in rats, then in
none of them
monkeys.
Speaking.
Right, exactly. And so people spend millions and millions of dollars developing the technology. Just getting FDA approval requires hundreds of thousands of dollars to go through to know what all the paperwork is that has to be satisfied.
It's not just time.
Right, and so the progress is really mainly limited now by the number of labs that are capable of doing this, and that in turn is very dependent on the funding for these sorts of things.
And on that note, then really, if you could get the commitment, the funding and stuff, this would really take off. This would be a very exciting area, really.
And there are groups that have done amazing things outside of speech. So most of the effort in this area has been on arm movements, so getting the capability of controlling robotic arms. And you may have seen, there have been on many news shows examples of people doing this. So now with existing systems, people are capable of doing things like picking up a water bottle and giving themselves water from a very complex arm, robotic arm.
Exactly, but it's still not speech. It's not like speech. It's not as complicated as speech.
And it's still limited to laboratory demonstrations at this point.
I see.
So much of the effort now is, rather than scientific discovery, it's more along the lines of engineering, making the system robust, making it work outside of the laboratory where there are interfering electrical signals and many things that we control in the laboratory. We have to overcome those problems to make the system usable outside the laboratory before they'll be able to take one of these things home and use it for speaking or for moving around in a wheelchair. But every week people are making discoveries that are really improving the systems, and the rate of improvement is very, very promising. It's a matter of years, not decades, I think, before these systems start moving into households where people can actually use the system, every day.
That is a wonderful, promising note to end on. I must say that is really exciting. This is in less than one generation that they've come. They've done this. So, and that's the worst case. The locked-in is the worst case. So it sort of bodes well for all the other kinds of disabilities in terms of speech, that there will be great progress. And in addition, to be able to learn this much about an extremely complicated aspect of the human brain. Yeah,
and with speech, I mean, really the biggest complexity is knowing what the brain signals mean, and again, the modeling work, all this work that was done not on Lockedin Syndrome originally, comes to fruition in these sorts of systems. So it really highlights how many aspects of science have to come together to solve such a difficult problem.
But what an exciting time to be doing this kind of work. And you're right out there at the front of it. Dr. Guenther, thank you very much for all this wonderful information. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.